Hello everyone, lovely to see you all. I wish I could be with you, but I can't. We all know why. Today I want to talk to you, if you'll allow me, about a great Kerry man, Tom Crean, a really special man, unbelievably brave, courageous, and he saved people's lives, and you can't ask more than that for anybody. But let's start at the beginning. This is Tom, very, very famous Irishman, and you should be proud the Irish to be associated with Tom Crean. And he was born on this farm a long time ago, 1877. At the time, there was no work for young lads. And so Tom decided to join the Navy because it was a job. And so he went off and became a sailor. And he just happened to be in the right place at the right time because in 1901, Captain Scott was going to the Antarctic to make the first exploration of this unknown continent, miles from anywhere. Nobody lived there. It's extremely cold and extremely dangerous. And here they are. Their ship went down to the ice and was immediately trapped. And to get out of there, eventually they had to use dynamite to blow a path so that the ship could escape to open water. Antarctica is not like anywhere else. It is, as I said, extremely cold. It's very, very dangerous. There's nobody lives there, so you can't ask people how to get along. You just have to put up with it. And Tom was one of the first men to leave a footprint in the Antarctic snow because hardly anybody had ever been there before. A handful of people. And here he is in the bottom right-hand corner. You may be able to see him there, smoking his pipe. But if you look at the clothes are not much different to, you might see somebody working on a farm these days. But it's very, very cold when they took the photographs. And here we have another picture of Tom on the very first expedition, and that's him there. And how do we know that's him? Because in his hand, he's got flag, the British flag, but with the Irish emblem on it. He was a very, very proud Irishman, and he stood out because he was incredibly brave. And here they are on the march, and it gives you some idea. And the reason I show you this photograph is because when you go to the Antarctic, you have to take everything with you. It's not like anywhere else. There are no fields, there are no trees, there's no bushes, there's no grass. There's no shops. You can't go for food and buy some more if you run out. So everything you need, you've got to put it on the sledge and you've got to carry it and drag it for hour after hour after hour. And here you can see the men straining to pull the sledge. And this is what Tom and his comrades had to do. It was extremely hard work and very, very dangerous. One day, one of Tom's men suffered very severe frostbite, and frostbite happens when it's very, very cold. It's so cold that the blood stops circulating to parts of your body. You usually get frostbite in your fingers or your toes, or maybe your nose or your ears, what you might call the ends of your body. Well, this man had a frostbitten foot, but they would be about maybe 200 kilometers from the ship. Nobody knew where they were. There was nobody coming to get them. They didn't have hot water bottles. They certainly didn't have a phone. And so these men in this tent, freezing, with this man with a big frozen foot. And I have to tell you that you had to bring that foot back to life, get the blood circulating, otherwise he'd be in very, very serious trouble. But how do you do it? Well, what they did is they sat in the tent and they lifted up their shirts, took your man's shoes and socks off, and they put his big cold foot on their belly. You couldn't keep it there for very long because it was like an ice lolly. If somebody put an ice lolly on your belly, you couldn't keep it there for very long. But that's what they did. And they went round the tent. So when they could only stand it for about a minute or two, they went to the next fella and lifted up that man's shirt and shoved the foot on his belly in the hope that he would be able to stand it a bit more, which of course only men could do it for only about 1 or 2 minutes. But I tell you what, this incredible act saved that man's foot. And he brought it back, slowly brought it back to life and got the blood going again. And he lived to be 89 years of age. Isn't that something else? And this is the Antarctic, I said to you. It's very, very beautiful, absolutely stunning place, but it's very dangerous. And when Captain Scott went back to the South Pole in 1911, he took Tom Crean as one of his first men that he took with him because he knew he could rely on Tom. He was as tough as old boots, as they say. He also had a smile on his face. Here he is going to work with his pipe. And you might wonder about the pipe. It's not a good idea to smoke, as you know. But in those days, if you were in the Navy, you got very, very cheap tobacco. So pretty much everybody smoked. It was easier to find someone it was harder to find somebody who didn't smoke than it was to find men who did. So that's why you see lots of these photographs with Tom smoking a pipe. Not a good idea, but that's the way it was in those days. And they took ponies with them on this expedition. And this is Tom on the left, as you can see, inspecting his pony. And that pony was called Bones. Bones was a very, very tough old horse, but ponies really aren't suited for the Antarctic ice because, like I said, it's extremely cold and the poor ponies struggled really, really badly. And they had to put them out of their misery in the end. But Tom kept his pony going for as long as he could. And it was one of the last ponies to die because Tom, a farmer's son from Kerry, knew how to look after animals. And so he was one of the best looking after animals. And they set off to reach the South Pole. And Tom is in that picture, although we can't see which one he is. But it gives you some idea. Very, very hard work. Maybe you'd be pulling that sledge for 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours a day. Extremely tiring. And at the end of the day, they were so exhausted, they just collapsed in the tent. They barely had the strength to eat their dinner. They were so tired. And for some of these men, it was the last thing they did, because this is Captain Scott's party. And they did reach the South Pole, but they all died on the way back because they didn't take enough food on the sledge. Tom survived and saved a man's life because of his bravery. And here he is at the end of that very, very difficult journey in which he saved a man's life. And as I said at the beginning, you can't do any more than that for anybody but to save another man's life. And it was Tom's courage that was his great feat that people recognized in him. And so he buried Scott here, went out a few months later, found Scott's dead body and buried him in the snow. And he's still there today. But it was his courage that appealed to everybody. And here we can see Tom standing at the wheel of the ship, going on his third expedition with Ernest Shackleton, another great Irish explorer. And they took their ship into the ice, and lo and behold, it was surrounded by ice straight away and trapped. And here it is, absolutely trapped. And you can see a man here trying to get off. The ship was doomed. It only ever made one voyage, and that was to the bottom of the ocean. And so they lived on the land. They transferred all their gear, all their equipment, the tents, the food, everything. And here they are. This is the end of the ship that the men set up camp just opposite with the dogs watching. And dogs, of course, were a very familiar theme for Tom Crean because Tom, the farmer's son from Kerry, knew how to look after dogs. How about that? These are the puppies that were born. And Tom was regarded as somebody said, he was like their mother. He made sure they got fed, he reared them. So these puppies are now only a few days old and they're absolutely beautiful animals. Here they are, there's another bunch of them. And you can see absolutely gorgeous animals, beautiful, cuddly, furry. And Tom, big, rugged farmer's son, knew how to care for them. But here's a word of warning. These dogs were wild animals. They don't look it there. They look absolutely cuddly and beautiful, for sure. But they were wild animals, and they were not to be treated as pets. In fact, they weren't pets. They were at this age because they're clearly only a few days old. But then they get bigger. And I mean big. And they would eat anything. They hunt in packs like wolves, and they would chase you down if they could and attack you for food. They're wild animals. They're not trained as pets. You couldn't put them in the garden and forget about them. And when I mentioned that they were big, I meant really big. Just look at the size of those dogs. And if they came after you, if they were hungry, you were in real trouble. You're like being chased by a polar bear. The thing is that these dogs didn't know any better. If they got hungry, they would go mad for food. And the most important thing in that picture is the chain that's holding the dog down. Now, I would imagine that photograph was taken after the dogs had been fed, so they were content. But you wouldn't be able to take that photograph if they hadn't eaten, because they would have attacked the man. So you had to understand dogs, and you had to be a really good, knowledgeable person. And that was Tom Crean. Like I said, the farmer's son from Kerry who knew how to look after animals. And he was one of the best of the men looking after the dogs. And so without a ship, they had to find their way home, but nobody knew where they were. They didn't have a big boat to go in. They had 3 little boats. There was no radio, no telephones. They couldn't call anybody to come and rescue them. So they set out to try and march across the ice to reach land. That was impossible. So they waited and waited for the ice to break up, which it did eventually. But they were on the ice for nearly a year and a half, waiting for the ice to break up. And eventually they were able to sail their 3 little boats, and they were very little. And you can see in amongst the icebergs here, very, very dangerous. And Tom was in command of the smallest boat. And they reached a place called Elephant Island, where there are no elephants. There are elephant seals. But Elephant Island is very, very remote. It is miles from anywhere, hundreds and hundreds of miles from anywhere. Nobody knew they were there. They couldn't contact a passing ship because there were no passing ships. And so it was decided that they would leave the 22 men on the beach, and Tom and Shackleton and 4 others would sail in one of these boats and get rescue. So that's 6 men in the boat, and they left the other 22 on this desolate beach. And it's a terrible, terrible place, Elephant Island. But of course, this was an extremely risky journey. And here they are setting out. Nobody knew whether they could make it. And Tom, a man of the sea, been a sailor since he was 16, he knew what to do. He was a great help. And there was another Irishman, there was Shackleton, Crean, and another Irishman called Tim McCarthy, who was another great seaman. And the three of the 6 men on the boat were Irish. And they were the ones at the end of the journey who were still standing. And they managed to reach a place called South Georgia. And South Georgia is not a particularly attractive place, but it was a place where they knew they could find a ship and go back and rescue their men who were still on the island, on Elephant Island. But the problem was that they landed on the wrong side of South Georgia, and they were too exhausted to row round, so they had to walk across those mountains. And they set off without a tent, So they had no shelter. If they'd run into a blizzard, they would have been in real trouble. But they didn't. They were very, very lucky. And it was Tom's great strength and his sense of humour and his great resolve. He refused to budge. He refused to let the ice get to him and the cold. And he was often the cook because he knew how to look after himself, and they trusted him. And eventually they got through, and they found, we don't have a photograph of them marching, unfortunately, but this was, they marched for a day and a half on very, very, very few rations. They had no shelter. If, as I said, if there'd been a blizzard, they would have been in very serious trouble. But Tom kept their spirits up. He used to sing a song. He would crack jokes whilst he was cooking. And here they are. They got through to the whaling station. And this is Tom Crean here. And this is Shackleton, the other Irishman. And they then had only one thing on their mind. It wasn't that they had been saved. It was how to get back and rescue their friends who were still on Elephant Island, about 1,200 kilometers away. Very, very cold, very hungry and desperate. And of course, the men on Elephant Island, here they are, they didn't know if Tom and Shackleton had got through. For all they knew, they could have drowned. And instead of this terrible episode coming to a quick end, it was the opposite. Because this was the height or the worst of the Antarctic winter. And the ice was still surrounding Elephant Island. And so they couldn't get in with their ship. They made 4 attempts. 4.5 months. They kept coming backwards and forwards to Elephant Island, and they couldn't get in. They couldn't get past the ice. And it wasn't until the early spring, as the ice began to break up with the warmer weather, that they came through and were able to rescue the men. And the first question they asked is, "Are you all well?" And all 22 of them had survived. Some had suffered very badly, but all of them had lived, and they were rescued. And here is Tom. He's in that boat. We can't pick him out, unfortunately, but he'd be in that little boat rescuing his comrades. And they were so delighted. And here they are, all together, back on dry land, all 28 of them now reunited. And here's Tom Crean, this man here, at the end, about 6 from the end. And the interesting thing about this photograph is this is the last picture of Tom Crean as an explorer. Because when they'd finished taking their photographs and having a good meal, and hopefully they went and had a bath because they hadn't had a wash for over a year, they all went back into the Navy, which was their jobs. And of course, the war was going on then, the First World War. Tom Crean was a sailor with the British Navy, and so he went back and he fought in the war. He took a few weeks off and he got married. And they had 3 children, 3 girls. One of them didn't live very long, unfortunately. And the 2 younger girls, Mary is the taller one, and Eileen lived a very, very long and happy life. And in the village of Alnaskor, which some of you would know, Tom and his wife Eileen opened a pub. And the pub is still there today, the South Pole Inn. And as you can see, it mentions Tom Crean's name on the front. And if you go in there with your parents, you can see on the walls of the pub are lots and lots of photographs of Tom Crean and his exploits. It's a lovely place to visit. Make sure your parents are with you, but it's a great place to visit, and it's a great shrine. And people come from all over the world now to see Tom Crean's pub because they recognise that he was a truly great man. And this is the last photograph we have of Tom, who was around about 60, 61 when this photograph was taken. And he died quite young, very sadly, in 1938. So I never got to meet him, even though I've written a book about him, or written 2 books about him. I never got to meet him, sadly. And he passed away in 1938. But the pub is still open, and hopefully when we all return to normal, the South Pole Inn will return to normal. And for one last bit of this part of the show is to tell you this is the mountain in the Antarctic, which is named after Tom Crean. So he's not forgotten in the Antarctic. His name will last forever. So that's the great Tom Crean. And I'll just stop the pictures for a moment because I know some of you have got some questions, and I received a whole pile of questions. I won't be able to do them all. There's too many. But in particular, John Transer from Abbeyfield School sent me some fabulous questions, and we'll just run through some of those if you can bear with me. But they are questions which a lot of people ask me over the years because I've written 2 books about Tom Crean. I wrote this one called The Iceman, which is in the schools now and people get taught about Tom Crean. But the book that came first was this one, which is the adult version of the book called Unsung Hero. And this is the book which started Tom Crean, brought Tom Crean back to life, because before that, nobody knew anything about him. He was an unsung hero. He was forgotten. He never spoke about his exploits. And so when he died, he literally took his story to the grave. And as a result, people didn't know about him. Somebody asked me, this is a terrific question, what do you think Tom would have done if he'd had modern equipment? Now, that's a really great question, because he'd have better clothing, that's for sure. He'd have been better fed, that's for sure. And he'd have been better protected. And also he would have had a radio to communicate with his comrades. Everything today is better than it was in Tom Crean's day, which actually tells you what a remarkable character he was, that he survived without the benefits of modern equipment. But the basic question is, would he, how would he have done, as the child said to me? Well, what they would have done is they would have done better, but remember that a blizzard is a blizzard. And if it's minus 40 degrees, it's still a blizzard. It doesn't matter what you're wearing, what you've eaten, and whether you've got a good radio or not. It's still a blizzard. And Tom Crean survived the worst of the Antarctic weather because, as I said, he was a remarkable man. And that's the point. So another question, which again is one that I'm often asked. Yeah, this is a good question. Just to put me on the spot, you realize that. Did anything in your research disappoint you about Tom Crean? Yes. I never met him. I'd love to have met him. I'd love to have sat down, had a pint with him and chatted about his exploits. That's my biggest regret about doing with Tom Crean. Somebody's asked if I'm going to make a film about him. Well, I'm working on it. Don't tell anybody, but I'm working on it. Why did Tom join the Navy, says another person? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, there were no jobs in Ireland at that time, particularly for young lads. And so if they either stayed on the farm and worked hard, or they went into the army or the Navy, or they emigrated to America or Australia, something like that. They had to do something major to find work. And Tom chose the Navy. To be fair, there is a big tradition in Kerry, and there always has been, of youngsters going off to sea. You will know, for example, that Brendan the Voyager, from a very, very long time ago, set off to find North America from a place not far from where Tom Crean was born. And the first Irishman to walk to the South Pole comes from Tralee. So, what inspired me to write the book? This is the most common question I get asked. And it's 2 things. First is that Tom was completely unknown, and therefore nobody had written about him before. He was, people knew his name, but they didn't know much about him. And I wanted to put the record straight, and I wanted, in a sense, to put him on the map. And the other thing is that he became a legend without anybody's help. He wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He didn't have any, everything he did was by his own efforts. And I think for children in particular, there's an inspirational message there that you can achieve anything you want if you work hard enough at it. And Tom Crean is a classic example of how you can do that. Somebody said to me, what age were you when I wrote the book? Well, I was about 52, but it took 3 years. So it's not a fair answer, really. But it took 3 years to do the research and the writing of the book because there was so much to work to do. Why did I pick him out? Well, I picked him out because he was the unsung hero, and he was the man that nobody had talked about or written about. And so I was determined to put him on the map. And I wanted to tell the story of explorers through the eyes of this ordinary farmer's son, who was, quite clearly an inspirational man. Another one asked me how long I've been an author. Well, I've been writing books for about 20 years, but before that, I used to work as a journalist on newspapers. And so I've been writing for too many years to mention. What's it like being an author, says somebody? The answer is it beats going to work. The only trouble is you're your own boss. But on the other hand, there's nobody giving out to me. So it's not like being at school if you fail to deliver your homework on time and the teacher gives out to you. There's nobody giving out to me. So I have to be quite disciplined to make sure I get on with the work. But what it does mean is that I can write about who I like. And that's why I chose to write about Tom Crean. Somebody's also asked, this is my favourite question in a way, because I get asked this a lot. What is your favourite part of the Iceman book? And for me, it's chapter 10, for those of you who've got the book or can pick a copy up later. Chapter 10 is where Tom saves the life of a man called Lieutenant Evans. This is, I keep using the word remarkable, but in Tom's case, he was a remarkable man. In this case, this is a truly astonishing story of unbelievable courage and heroism and the ability to survive against almost impossible odds. And why did he do it? He did it to save another man's life. And as I said at the very beginning, you can't ask any more from anybody than that they would risk their own life to save your life. It's a phenomenal story, and it's very moving. I know people who've said that when they read my coverage of that story, that they were in tears because it was such a moving subject. Do I have any pets? I'm not sure where that comes in. No, I had a cat for many years. He used to sit on my desk, the desk I'm talking to you from now. I still miss him. He died a long time ago, but he was great. When did I find out about Tom? That's an interesting question because I wasn't very much different in age to you guys. Because one day I was at school, I'm not sure what age I would have been, maybe 12, 13 perhaps. And I was in the school library and I just came across a book. It was a picture book really, about Captain Scott. And I knew nothing about it at all, but I was intrigued by the pictures. And so I took the book, took it home, read it, looked at the pictures. And in that book, I found the names of all the men who went and travelled on the same expedition as Captain Scott, which of course included Tom Crean. And ever since then, so at the age of 12, 13, 14, something like that, I just got absolutely hooked on these expeditions. And I bought more and more books. And you can probably just see over my shoulder, there's a selection of my books. And I've got so many that over my other shoulder, this way, the bookshelf just collapsed because I had too many books on it. So I've got hundreds of books about explorers now, but my favourite books are still the books about Tom Crean. So my interest goes right back to my school days. I must have about 500 books, I think, although at the moment they're on the floor because my shelves collapsed. Would I like to explore? Well, I would, but I'm a writer, so I don't think I'd be very good, to be honest. And I don't think I have the same courage and resolve as Tom Crean. But but in principle, yes, I would like to, but I don't think it's for me. I've spent too long sitting at a desk, so I wouldn't be much use to him. I wouldn't be as good as him, but it's a good question. Have you met any other authors? The answer is yes, but not in the way that you do, because we don't work together. An author works on his own, his or her own. It's not like, say, being a teacher or a librarian, where your teachers will go off to the staff room and have a cup of tea with each other. I have to make my own cup of tea basically, and sit, and I'm on my own. I don't mind that. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely enjoy working on my own, but it's not like working in an office or in a shop or in a school or a library. So I don't mind, but some people would, and it's horses for courses. How long did it take to write the book? Well, I mentioned earlier that I wrote this book first, the adult book, which took 3 years. And then I wrote this, which took another year. So the 2 books took 4 years altogether. How many dogs went on the 3 expeditions? This is not an easy, it might sound like an easy question. It's not an easy one to answer. The simple reason is that dogs do what the dogs did, what dogs tend to do, which is they had puppies. So you had a complete turnover of the numbers of dogs. And we saw those lovely photographs of Tom holding the puppies, as in this picture here. So the number of dogs turned over all the time, but they would have started out with between 30 and 60 dogs, because the dogs were meant to drag the sledges. But it's not an easy job dragging sledges, and to teach the dogs to drag a sledge is a very difficult task. And the explorers never quite came to terms with that. They never quite did it well. So the dogs were underused. And of course, on the expedition where the ship sank, there was no use for dogs at sea. Dogs couldn't swim that far. So anywhere between 30 and 60 dogs, I'd say. Did I find Tom Crean's story myself? Well, I suppose I did, in the sense, like I mentioned, that I'd picked it up at school and found the story interesting. But I started with pretty much nothing. So what I would say to the person who asked me the question is, it's a bit like a jigsaw. That if you tip a jigsaw out onto a table, where do you start? You start with the edges, don't you? And so I really, as a child, I started with the edges of this very, very big jigsaw. And it took me, well, 3 years to put the jigsaw together with my research. Somebody wants to know what age I was when I had children. Well, I have 2 lovely sons when I was in my mid-20s, and I have 2 equally lovely granddaughters. How long did Tom pull a sledge for every day, says another? That would depend on the circumstances, but I would say between 10 and 12 hours. So they would start work, when it was very, very hard work, let's say at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they would be pulling their sledge until 9 o'clock at night. And the only break they had would be to go to the loo or to have a bite to eat, maybe boil a kettle and have a cup of tea to warm themselves up. Extremely hard work. It's difficult to think of any harder job. I'm sure some of your parents will be shouting at me now, but in general, it's a very, very tough job. Another one asked me a very interesting question. Was Tom's diary found in the Antarctic? Well, the short answer to that is no. And the reason is that he didn't keep a diary. And so we don't have very much of the words that he wrote down himself. And it's important to make this point. This is a really good question, because Tom would have not had a great education, and therefore he wasn't used to writing in the way that you guys would be used to writing or sending text messages these days. But he wouldn't have been used to it, so he didn't write very much, and that reflected the fact that he didn't have a good education. And it does remind me to say to you, you should be very, very pleased that you're getting a great education in Ireland, because when you leave school, you can choose what you do with your life, where you can go, where you can work, what jobs you can do. In Tom Crean's day, although he was a great man, he didn't have those choices. He couldn't make the choice. So you're better equipped in many ways. Do I like writing books? Yes, I do. It's great. But you are on your own, as I mentioned. I don't mind that. But bringing Tom to life, which is what I've done, has been the joy of my life. It's been a fantastic thing to have done. And that you may not know this, but the adult book, which I mentioned earlier, this one, have been very, very popular. And it's sold more than 100,000 copies. And it's been translated into lots of foreign languages as well. The Chinese language, not by me, I might add. I don't read Chinese. It's been translated into German, Italian, Korean, and there is an Irish language version of the Iceman story, which is great for me. I'm really pleased that it is in the Irish language. I think it's very appropriate, because Tom Crean would have been an Irish speaker, that's for sure. What's the most inspiring thing about Tom? The most inspiring thing about him is that he was a survivor. So whatever was thrown at him, whatever circumstances were thrown up, such as very bad weather, starvation, the loss of the ship, Captain Scott's death, all of those things, whatever was thrown at him, he coped with it. And he came out the other end. And it's interesting that he is one of the oldest survivors. Lots of the other guys died, like Captain Scott, Shackleton, they died when they were quite young men. Tom didn't. He beat them all. Although he didn't have the great education, he was a survivor. So that's, for me, is his great it's inspirational. Would I write another book? Well, I've just written one, actually. So I'm going to have to. I have a new book which is for adults called Icebound in the Arctic. It's about an Irishman called Francis Crozier. Maybe your parents would be interested in that. But I am thinking about writing another book, perhaps with children in mind. What's my favourite book? Well, I think you can probably tell from what I'm saying. It's got to be these two, isn't it? It's got to be Unsung Hero and Iceman, depending on which audience you're dealing with, because children see books in a slightly different way to adults, and adults see books in a different way to children. So somebody's asked a brilliant question, which you'll have to bear with me because it's quite a lot. They've asked, why was Tom not picked to go to the South Pole with Captain Scott? And of course, Captain Scott died on that expedition, so Tom may well have died himself. It's hard to be precise because clearly all the people who were involved are not around anymore. I think that if you analyse events, then the answer can be found in the fact that there were 3 men sent back by Captain Scott, which was Tom, a fellow called Bill Lashley, who was a friend of Tom's, and Lieutenant Evans. And both Evans and Lashley were quite sick or quite tired, really. They were exhausted. Tom was as fit as a butcher's dog. He was in incredible shape, considering what he'd been through. And so I think Captain Scott sent Tom back with Bill Lashley and Lieutenant Evans as a kind of insurance policy to make sure they all got back. That's the best view. Obviously, we don't know for sure, but that's my view. Somebody's asked me a slightly cheeky question. Nothing wrong with a cheeky question. What's your least favourite part of the book? And a cheeky answer, the end, because I didn't want it to finish. Where did you get your love of books? Well, I don't know really. really discovered books later in life. I always wanted to be a journalist when I was a youngster, and I did that. My mother was Irish, and perhaps she has in her family a shonky. Maybe I'm just a storyteller. I think I like passing on the stories. What's the process of writing? Somebody says, well, I write actually at the desk where you can see me now, and I write at a computer overlooking the garden. I often have music on in the background, unusual. A lot of writers like to work in silence. I actually like music. And I would start work at around about 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, depending on what time I stir. I'm not a morning person, I have to say. I'd make a terrible farmer. And then I'll work around on a normal day, you know, till 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock at night, depending on what's going on. And if it's one of the things about being a writer, if you're finding it hard to write for whatever reason, the words aren't flowing or you're not feeling well or whatever, you can just stop. And so I would stop and maybe go downstairs, put the television on, watch some football or something. It's a nice job in that sense. Tell us about your family, says another person. Well, my mother was from County Roscommon. And as a child, I used to come backwards and forwards to Ireland all the time. So I have a great fondness for Ireland. And in fact, I have an Irish passport. So I'm as Irish as I can get without being Irish. My wife and I, we live in the south of England. And we have 2 sons. And as I said, 2 lovely grandchildren. Where did I get all my information from? Well, I spent hours in libraries reading through the letters and the diaries. You remember I mentioned that Tom Crean didn't keep a diary, didn't write many letters because he wasn't educated. But other men on these expeditions did. And so they will have written down things about Tom. And so I had to sift through this mountain of documents, seeing what they said about him. And so that's one of the reasons it took so long, because there was a lot of stuff to go through, plus my books. I had to read all those books and pick up bits and pieces of information. And of course, I also interviewed people, and I went back to Unsung, and I met people who remembered Tom Crean. They were very, very elderly people, but they remembered Tom Crean. They remember walking down the street with Tom. And they were able to pass on a few anecdotes. And most important of all, is that I met Tom's 2 daughters, Eileen and Mary, who became very good friends of mine, I'm pleased to say. Lovely, lovely women. Unfortunately, they're no longer with us, but they were very helpful in telling me stories about the family and about Unsung when they were growing up. So it's back to my analogy about the jigsaw. You piece it all together very slowly. Did I ever go into the South Pole Inn? The answer is, don't tell my wife, but lots and lots and lots of times. The hardest bit is getting out of the pub because the man who owns the South Pole Inn is a good friend of mine. And so we always have a jar together and end up chatting till into the early hours. So as I say, yes, I've been in the pub many times. Getting out of it is the hard bit. You'll understand that. Did I ever go to Tom's grave? I did, yeah. I've found it before. And I would recommend if those of you who are interested, you should go up. It's just outside the village of Unsung at Ballinacurty, perhaps a mile up the road, if that. And it's now a place where people come from all over the world to pay their respects to Tom Crean, which is lovely because he was a man who you could like. Do I have any plans for other children's books? Possibly. I'll see what happens. I haven't made up my mind on that, to be honest. So the answer is possibly. If you met Tom Crean, what would you say to him? Well, that's a simple, and it's simply impossible to answer because I'd have 1,000 questions as a writer. You know, I don't know where I'd start. I suppose probably what I would say is, what are you drinking? Can I buy you a pint? And we'll sit down and chat about it, because I'd have to go through his whole remarkable, incredible life. But I suppose one of the questions I would ask is, where did he get his courage from? Can can you get it in a bottle? Because he was a truly astonishing man. Another person, possibly the same one, do you think I would have survived in the Antarctic? Probably not, actually. I don't think I'm made of the same stuff as Tom Crean. I like to write down his story and bring it to people like you, but I'm not sure that I'm made of the same stuff, sadly. Did I ever see the statue? I did. The statue was put up, it's right opposite the pub in Aylescombe, and it was put up partly because of the popularity of my book. So it was an excuse for people to recognise and honour Tom Crean, and I was at the ceremony with his daughter, which was very, very nice. Actually, it was a very nice occasion. Somebody asks me a very personal question: do I idolise anyone? I idolise people who make other people's lives better, if that's not copping out. So I would think, for example, President Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King would spring to mind. But the list will be quite long. And I would admire, obviously, I would admire Tom Crean for his inspirational courage and the fact that he literally saved other men's lives. You can't do much better than that. What did the men do to pass the time on the ice whilst the ship was being trapped? Well, they played cards and they read books and they chatted and they slept a lot. It was very boring because in the Antarctic, I'm not sure whether you know, during the winter, the sun goes down and doesn't rise for 4 months. So for 24 hours a day during the winter, it's totally black. And you wouldn't go out for a stroll because it was too cold. So it was quite boring for them. Did I ever meet Tom's family? Yes, I mentioned earlier that I'd met Eileen and Mary, the 2 daughters, and I know many of the grandchildren because Eileen and Mary had their own children, and some of them live in Kerry, and I'm pleased to say they're my friends, and I have great respect for them. What was your first book you wrote? It was this one, the adult book about Tom Crean. Whose life is more interesting, Tom Crean or Ernest Shackleton? Gosh, you asked some tough questions. They're 2 different characters, to be fair. Tom being a simple farmer's son, not very educated, but raw courage and inspiration. Shackleton was a well-educated man, but he was an inspirational leader of men and a man, again, a great survivor. And so I don't think that it'd be fair to compare one with the other. What was the hardest part of Tom's life? I think the hardest part is what I keep saying here. The hardest part was surviving. So when others fell by the wayside or perished in the cold or starved to death, he just kept going. And that's why he was a remarkable man. He didn't fall by the wayside. And the last question is, in a sense, I have answered this already, but I don't mind again. Who inspired you to be an author and what authors do you like? I don't have any particular favourites because I tend to read history books, and history books, authors don't write very many books. Historians don't write many books, I should say. So what's it like? What inspired you to be an author? Well, I said it half in jest, but I think there must be a shonky somewhere in my family because I love telling stories and I like passing on the stories to people, particularly youngsters, because, you know, hopefully you will pick up the story and when you grow up, you might think of either becoming an explorer or reading books, not just my books, but reading books about the subject. So I'm a storyteller, and that's what I enjoy most. So with that, I'll give up and go back to storytelling. It's been lovely to talk to you. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, any further questions, please get in touch with Kerry County Council. I'm sure they'll pass it on to me. So for now, good luck.